The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists as Sheriff Karen stood over me, her cold eyes gleaming with satisfaction. My 8-year-old daughter watched from our front porch, tears streaming down her face as I was dragged away from my own home. The charge: operating an illegal public nuisance. The evidence: a small wooden box filled with children's books that I had built to share with my neighborhood. As they shoved me into the patrol car, Karen leaned down and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "You should have just taken down that damn library when I asked nicely." 6 months earlier, my life was completely different. I lived on Maple Street in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew their neighbors and children played safely in the yards. I had always been a reader, the kind of person who carried a book everywhere, and believed deeply that stories could change lives. After retiring from my job as a school librarian, I wanted to find a way to keep sharing that love of reading with my community. The idea came to me one evening as I watched children walking home from the bus stop, many of them carrying worn backpacks and looking bored. I decided to build a little free library right at the edge of my property, where the sidewalk met my front yard. It would be a simple wooden box, painted bright blue to match my shutters, with a clear door so people could see the books inside. I spent weeks building it with my own hands, sanding every surface smooth and painting it with 3 careful coats. The sign on top read, "Take a book, leave a book," in cheerful white letters. I filled it with children's books, mysteries, romance novels, and classics, arranging them carefully on the little shelves inside. The response from my neighbors was everything I had hoped for and more. Mrs. Peterson from next door stopped by every morning with her coffee to see what new books had appeared overnight. The Johnson children ran to check it after school, their excited voices carrying across the street as they discovered new adventures. Even old Mr. Martinez, who rarely spoke to anyone, would pause during his evening walks to browse through the selection. For 3 beautiful months, my little library became the heart of our neighborhood. People would linger to chat about books they had enjoyed. Children would beg their parents to walk past it on their way to the park, and I often saw teenagers secretly grabbing novels when they thought no one was looking. It was exactly what I had dreamed it could be. Then Sheriff Karen noticed it. I first saw her black and white patrol car creeping slowly down Maple Street on a Tuesday morning in late October. She drove at maybe 10 miles per hour, her head turned toward my house, studying my little library with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. She did not stop that day, but something about the way she stared made my stomach twist with unease. The next day, she came back. This time she pulled into my driveway and stepped out of her car with the deliberate movements of someone who had already made up her mind about something. Sheriff Karen was a tall woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. She wore her uniform like armor, every button and badge polished to perfection. "Ma'am," she said as I walked out to meet her, "I need to talk to you about this structure you have erected on your property." Structure? I looked at my cheerful little library box, and then back at her serious face. "It's just a little free library, Sheriff, for the neighborhood children and families." Her expression did not change. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to look into the proper permits and zoning requirements for structures like this. There may be ordinances that apply." I felt my first flicker of real concern. Ordinances for a book box. Any structure that could potentially impact traffic flow or create gathering points needs to be properly registered with the city, she said, her voice completely flat and official. "I am just giving you a friendly warning to check on that." As she walked back to her patrol car, I stood there feeling like I had been transported into some bizarre alternate reality where sharing books with children was somehow suspicious. Sheriff Karen returned exactly 1 week later, and this time she was not offering friendly warnings. She pulled into my driveway with the same deliberate precision, but now she carried an official clipboard and wore an expression that could freeze water. "Ma'am, I have a citation here for a zoning violation," she announced, tearing off a yellow slip of paper and holding it out to me. "Your structure is in violation of City Ordinance 47B regarding unpermitted installations in residential zones." I stared at the ticket in disbelief. The fine was $250, and there was a deadline for compliance. Remove the structure within 10 days or face additional penalties. "Sheriff, this is just a little wooden box with books in it. How can that possibly violate any ordinance?" Her voice took on a condescending tone that made my cheeks burn. "Ma'am, the law is the law. Size does not matter. If you want to operate any kind of public facility, you need to go through the proper channels. File the appropriate paperwork. Get the necessary permits. Follow the process like everyone else." After she left, I spent the entire afternoon researching city ordinances online and making phone calls to the planning department. What I discovered made my anger grow with every page I read. Ordinance 47B was designed for things like sheds, gazebos, and permanent structures that actually impacted property lines and neighborhood aesthetics. My little library was barely 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. More importantly, as I drove around my neighborhood that evening, I counted at least a dozen structures that were far larger and more permanent than my library box. The Hendersons had a decorative wishing well in their front yard. The Carters had installed a large wooden playground set that extended almost to the sidewalk. Mrs. Wu had a garden shed that was clearly visible from the street. None of them had ever been cited for anything. I decided to try reasoning with Sheriff Karen directly. I called the sheriff's department the next morning and asked to speak with her. "Sheriff, I researched the ordinance you cited, and I think there may be a misunderstanding," I said when she finally came to the phone. "My library box is much smaller than many other structures in the neighborhood that have never been cited." "Ma'am, I suggest you focus on your own property and follow the law as it has been explained to you," she replied coldly. "Other people's situations are not your concern. But surely you can see that this seems like selective enforcement." The line went quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something that was almost a whisper. "Ma'am, I strongly advise you to remove that structure and avoid any further complications. Do I make myself clear?" The threat in her voice was unmistakable. I hung up the phone with my hands shaking. Over the next few days, I noticed Sheriff Karen's patrol car on my street more frequently. She would drive by slowly, sometimes twice in a single hour, her eyes always fixed on my house. My neighbors began to comment on it. "What's with all the police presence lately?" Mrs. Peterson asked me over the fence. "Is everything okay?" I tried to explain the situation, but even saying it out loud made it sound absurd. A sheriff was harassing me over a box of free books. Despite my fear, I could not bring myself to take down something that had brought so much joy to my community. Instead, I decided to fight back through official channels. I spent an entire weekend preparing a formal complaint to file with the city council, documenting the selective enforcement and gathering photographs of other unpermitted structures in the neighborhood. I was still naive enough to believe that logic and fairness would prevail. The city council meeting was held on the third Tuesday of November in a cramped conference room that smelled of old coffee and broken dreams. I arrived 30 minutes early, clutching a folder full of evidence and testimony letters from neighbors who supported my little library. I had dressed professionally, and prepared my arguments carefully, still believing that reasonable people would see the obvious injustice of the situation. Sheriff Karen arrived just as the meeting was called to order, and the change in the room's atmosphere was immediate. The 5 council members, who had been chatting casually with citizens, suddenly straightened in their chairs and adopted serious expressions. Karen took a seat in the front row, her uniform immaculate and her presence commanding. When my agenda item was called, I approached the podium with confidence. I explained the situation calmly and presented my evidence methodically. I showed photographs of larger structures throughout the neighborhood that had never been cited. I read statements from neighbors about how much the library meant to their families. I quoted the exact wording of the ordinance and explained why my small book box clearly did not meet the criteria for violation. The council members nodded politely, but avoided making eye contact with me. I could feel Sheriff Karen's cold stare on my back throughout my entire presentation. When I finished, Council Chairman Robert Davies asked if Sheriff Karen would like to respond. She stood and walked to the podium with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. Her voice was calm and authoritative as she painted a completely different picture of my little library. Council members, this structure presents several serious safety concerns that Mrs. Patterson seems unwilling to acknowledge, she began. First, it creates a potential traffic hazard as people stop their vehicles to access it. Second, it serves as an unsupervised gathering point where strangers could potentially approach children. Third, the resident has demonstrated a pattern of defying legal orders and questioning the authority of law enforcement. I sat there listening to her twist every positive aspect of community connection into something sinister and dangerous. According to Sheriff Karen, my attempt to promote literacy was actually creating opportunities for predators to target children. Furthermore, she continued, Mrs. Patterson has been uncooperative and argumentative in her interactions with my department. She has refused multiple opportunities to resolve this matter quietly and has instead chosen to waste city resources with frivolous complaints. The council members were nodding along with everything she said. Not one of them asked to see my evidence or questioned the logic of her safety concerns. Council member Sarah Mitchell asked, Sheriff, in your professional opinion, does this structure pose enough risk to warrant removal? Absolutely, Karen replied without hesitation. Public safety must always be our first priority. The vote was unanimous. My little library was officially declared a public nuisance that had to be removed within 48 hours or face daily fines of $100. As I walked out of that meeting, my face burning with humiliation and anger, I overheard Council Chairman Davies talking quietly with Sheriff Karen in the hallway. Thanks for handling that, Karen. We cannot have residents thinking they can just ignore zoning laws. No problem, Bobby. Always happy to help keep order. Bobby, she called him Bobby. That night I could not sleep. I kept replaying the meeting in my mind, analyzing every word and gesture. Something about the whole situation felt wrong beyond just the unfairness of it. The council members had deferred to Karen as if her word was law, and they had dismissed my evidence without even examining it. I decided to do some research into the relationships between Sheriff Karen and the city officials. What I discovered over the next few days made my blood boil. Council Chairman Davies was married to Karen's sister. Council Member Mitchell's husband worked as a deputy under Karen. The city planning commissioner who had signed off on my citation was Karen's brother-in-law. I was not fighting a simple zoning dispute. I was fighting a corrupt system where Sheriff Karen's family had their hands in every level of local government. The realization was terrifying, but it also crystallized my resolve. If I could not get justice through official channels, I would have to find another way. I became a detective in my own neighborhood, and what I uncovered made me sick to my stomach. Sheriff Karen was not just targeting me. She was systematically abusing her power to terrorize anyone who dared to question her authority or simply existed in a way that annoyed her. My investigation began with casual conversations during evening dog walks. I started with Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband had mentioned being pulled over frequently for routine checks that never seemed routine. "Oh, honey, you do not even know the half of it," she said, glancing around nervously as if Karen might be listening. "Miguel gets stopped at least twice a month. Always the same thing, asking for his license, registration, searching the car, finding nothing, then letting him go with a warning about some imaginary violation." Mrs. Rodriguez led me to the Washingtons, an elderly black couple who had lived on Oak Street for 30 years. What they told me made my hands shake with rage. "That woman has been harassing us for 2 years," Mr. Washington said quietly. "Started when we put up a Black Lives Matter sign in our yard. Suddenly, we were getting citations for grass being too long, trash cans being out too early, noise complaints when we had family barbecues." Mrs. Washington showed me a shoebox full of tickets and citations, each one for increasingly petty violations. She even gave us a ticket for having our garage door open during the day, said it was an eyesore that violated neighborhood standards. The pattern became clearer with each conversation. Karen targeted minorities, elderly residents, single mothers, and anyone who had ever questioned her authority. She used her badge as a weapon to punish people for existing in ways she did not approve of. The most horrifying story came from Jennifer Martinez, a single mother of 3 who lived 2 streets over. Jennifer worked double shifts as a nurse and often came home exhausted, sometimes leaving her children's bicycles and toys scattered in the yard. "She made my life hell for 6 months," Jennifer told me, tears streaming down her face. Citation after citation for toys being on the lawn, for my car being in the driveway instead of the garage, for my kids playing outside after what she decided was curfew. The fines ate up my grocery money. Jennifer's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The final straw was when she showed up at my workplace, told my supervisor that I was being investigated for child neglect because my yard was not properly maintained. I almost lost my job over that lie. I documented everything. I took photographs of Karen selectively enforcing parking violations, ignoring obvious infractions by white residents while ticketing minorities for the same behaviors. I recorded conversations with neighbors who had been targeted. I created a timeline showing the pattern of harassment that went back at least 3 years. When I tried to take this evidence to higher authorities, I hit brick wall after brick wall. The state police referred me back to local authorities. The county sheriff's office said it was outside their jurisdiction. The FBI's Civil Rights Division sent me automated responses that basically said they only investigated cases involving physical violence. I called the state attorney general's office and was transferred 4 times before reaching someone who actually listened to my story. The assistant I spoke with sounded sympathetic, but explained that police misconduct cases were incredibly difficult to prosecute without video evidence or multiple witnesses willing to testify under oath. "Most people are too scared to come forward," she told me. "They fear retaliation, and frankly, they are right to be afraid." That conversation was my wake-up call. I realized that Sheriff Karen had created a perfect system of intimidation. She held all the power, had family connections throughout the government, and had successfully frightened most of her victims into silence. But I was not most people. I was a retired librarian who understood research, documentation, and the power of information. If the system would not stop Karen through normal channels, I would have to create a situation where her corruption was so publicly exposed that even her family connections could not protect her. I spent weeks researching constitutional law, civil rights precedents, and municipal regulations. I studied cases where ordinary citizens had successfully challenged corrupt officials. I learned about media strategies and public pressure campaigns. Most importantly, I discovered something that would become the foundation of my counterattack: the legal requirements for municipal library services and the constitutional protections for public access to information. Karen had made a critical mistake when she chose to target my little free library. She had picked a fight with someone who understood exactly how powerful books and information could be. The idea came to me at 3 in the morning as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through legal precedents and constitutional protections. I sat up in bed with my heart pounding, finally seeing the perfect trap that would expose Karen's corruption while providing an unshakable legal foundation for my actions. I spent the next morning at the county law library, pulling every relevant case file and statute I could find. The research confirmed what I had suspected. Municipalities were legally required to provide reasonable access to library services for their residents. More importantly, the Supreme Court had repeatedly upheld that access to information and books was a fundamental First Amendment right that could not be arbitrarily restricted by local authorities. My consultation with civil rights attorney David Chen the following week was a turning point. David was in his 40s, sharp-eyed and passionate about constitutional law. When I explained my situation and outlined my research, his face lit up with the kind of excitement lawyers get when they smell a landmark case. "This is brilliant," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "You are not just fighting a zoning violation anymore. You are creating a constitutional test case about public access to information and the limits of local authority." David helped me refine my strategy. Instead of just rebuilding my little free library, I would create something that technically qualified as a legitimate public library branch, complete with all the legal protections that entailed. I filed the paperwork to establish the Maple Street Public Library branch. As a non-profit organization dedicated to providing free library services to underserved communities, I researched the minimum requirements for a public library under state law and designed a structure that met every single criterion while being obviously designed to make Sheriff Karen's life miserable. The construction phase was where my plan truly began to shine. I hired contractors to build a beautiful pavilion-style structure in my front yard, complete with solar panels for lighting, weatherproof storage cabinets, comfortable seating areas, and even a small desk for a volunteer librarian. The entire structure was professionally designed, properly permitted through the county rather than the corrupt city system, and built to exceed all building codes. I made sure every step of the construction was documented and legally bulletproof. I obtained permits from the county planning department, filed environmental impact statements, and even had the soil tested to ensure compliance with foundation requirements. When Sheriff Karen inevitably tried to stop the construction, she would find herself fighting against a mountain of legitimate paperwork and constitutional protections. The first sign that my plan was working came when Karen showed up at my house 3 days into construction, her face red with fury as she watched contractors installing the pavilion's roof. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she demanded, stomping across my lawn without any regard for the flower beds. I walked out to meet her with a clipboard full of permits and a calm smile on my face. I am establishing a public library branch to serve our community's educational needs, I replied. All the paperwork is filed with the appropriate authorities. You cannot just build whatever you want in a residential neighborhood. Actually, I can. Public libraries are considered essential community services under state law. I have all the necessary permits right here. I handed her copies of the county permits, the nonprofit incorporation documents, and a legal brief that David had helped me prepare explaining the constitutional protections for library services. Karen's hands shook as she flipped through the pages, her face growing redder with each document. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she realized that her usual tactics would not work this time. "This is some kind of trick," she finally said. "You are just trying to get around the law." "I am following the law exactly as it is written," I replied. "The same law you swore an oath to uphold when you became sheriff." She threw the papers back at me and stormed off, but not before I caught her making a phone call as she walked to her patrol car. I knew she was calling her family members in city government, looking for some way to stop what I was doing. Over the next week, I received visits from the city building inspector, the fire marshal, and even a county health department official. Each one arrived with obvious reluctance, clearly sent by someone with authority over them. Each one left empty-handed after confirming that my library project met or exceeded all applicable regulations. The beauty of my strategy was becoming clear. By operating at the county level instead of the corrupt city system, and by grounding everything in constitutional law instead of local ordinances, I had created a legal fortress that even Karen's family connections could not breach. As opening day approached, I could feel the tension building throughout the neighborhood. Word was spreading on social media about my confrontation with Sheriff Karen, and people were beginning to pay attention to the larger pattern of corruption and abuse. Opening day of the Maple Street Public Library branch dawned bright and clear, with that crisp autumn air that makes everything feel possible. I had planned a simple ribbon-cutting ceremony for 10 in the morning, expecting maybe a dozen neighbors and perhaps a reporter from the local weekly newspaper. Instead, I woke up to find news vans lining my street. The story had exploded on social media overnight. A video of my confrontation with Sheriff Karen during construction had been shared thousands of times, with comments ranging from outrage about police overreach to admiration for my creative resistance. Local Facebook groups were buzzing with stories from other residents who had been harassed by Karen, and my simple library opening had somehow become a symbol of standing up to corrupt authority. By 9:30, nearly 200 people had gathered on my front lawn and the surrounding sidewalks. Families with children, elderly residents, teenagers with smartphones recording everything, and even some people I recognized from other neighborhoods who had driven over to show support. The atmosphere was festive at first. Children ran between the crowd playing games while their parents admired the beautiful library pavilion and chatted about books and community building. Local news reporters interviewed visitors about why they had come, and I heard person after person talking about their own experiences with Sheriff Karen's harassment. Then at exactly 10:15, Karen's convoy arrived. 3 patrol cars led by Karen's black SUV pulled up with lights flashing but no sirens. The festive crowd immediately grew quiet as Karen stepped out of her vehicle, followed by 4 deputies who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the situation they were being ordered into. Karen was clearly trying to project authority and control, but I could see the tension in her shoulders and the slight tremor in her hands as she approached the crowd. She was not used to being challenged publicly, and the sea of faces staring at her with barely concealed hostility was clearly rattling her composure. "This is an illegal assembly," she announced in a voice that was meant to sound commanding, but came out slightly shaky. "You are all trespassing on private property and blocking public sidewalks. I need everyone to disperse immediately." The crowd did not move. If anything, people pressed closer together, forming a protective circle around my library pavilion. I stepped forward with my phone held high, live streaming the confrontation to Facebook and YouTube simultaneously. The viewer count was climbing rapidly as friends shared the stream and people tuned in to watch the showdown unfold in real time. "Sheriff, this is my private property, and these people are my invited guests," I said clearly, making sure my voice carried to both the crowd and the phone camera. "We are conducting a perfectly legal library opening ceremony." "You do not have permits for a public gathering of this size," Karen shot back, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. I pulled out my phone and opened the digital copy of my event permit, holding it up for everyone to see. "Actually, I do. Filed with the county 3 weeks ago, approved last Monday. Would you like to see it?" Karen's face flushed red as murmurs of laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Show her the receipts," and more people began recording with their phones. "This whole setup is a sham," Karen said, her voice rising with desperation. "You are trying to circumvent city authority with legal technicalities." "I am exercising my constitutional rights to provide library services to my community," I replied calmly. "The same constitutional rights you swore an oath to protect." That was when Karen made her fatal mistake. Perhaps it was the pressure of being challenged publicly, or maybe it was the sight of all those cameras recording her every word, but she completely lost her composure. "I do not care about your constitutional rights," she screamed. "I am the law in this county, and what I say goes. You will take down this illegal structure and stop this nonsense, or I will arrest every single person here." The crowd fell completely silent. Even her own deputies looked shocked by her outburst. On my phone screen, I could see the viewer count skyrocketing as people shared clips of her rant across social media. "Sheriff," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the silence, "did you just say that you do not care about constitutional rights?" The realization of what she had said hit Karen like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and I could see her scrambling mentally to find some way to walk back her words. But it was too late. In less than 30 seconds, she had destroyed years of carefully maintained authority by revealing her true contempt for the law she was supposed to enforce. That's not what I meant," she stammered. "It's exactly what you said," called out someone in the crowd. "We all heard it." "And we all recorded it," shouted another voice. As city officials began arriving to try to control the damage, I looked around at the faces in the crowd and realized that everything had changed. Sheriff Karen had exposed herself as the petty tyrant she had always been, and there was no going back from that moment. The video of Sheriff Karen's meltdown went viral within hours. By evening, clips of her screaming, "I do not care about your constitutional rights," were playing on cable news channels across the country. The hashtag #Sheriff Karen became a trending topic as people shared their own stories of police overreach and authoritarian abuse. My phone rang constantly for the next 3 days. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and dozens of smaller outlets all wanted interviews. The story had struck a nerve in a country already deeply concerned about police accountability and the abuse of power by local authorities. But the real explosion came when other victims of Karen's harassment began coming forward publicly. Jennifer Martinez, the single mother who had been terrorized for months, gave a tearful interview to the local news station, describing how Karen had nearly cost her job with false allegations. The elderly Washington couple appeared on a regional talk show with their shoebox full of petty citations, explaining how they had been targeted for displaying a Black Lives Matter sign. Within a week, the state attorney general's office announced they were opening a formal investigation into allegations of civil rights violations and selective enforcement by the sheriff's department. The FBI's Civil Rights Division, which had previously dismissed my complaints, suddenly returned my calls and scheduled interviews with multiple victims. The internal affairs investigation that followed was devastating. Records that Karen thought were safely buried in departmental files were subpoenaed and analyzed by federal investigators. Traffic stop data revealed a clear pattern of racial profiling. Citation records showed systematic targeting of minorities, elderly residents, and anyone who had filed complaints against the department. Most damaging of all was the discovery of Karen's personal notes and emails, which revealed her true motivations. In one email to her brother-in-law on the Planning Commission, she referred to my library as that uppity woman's book thing and asked him to find some way to shut it down permanently. Other messages showed her coordination with family members in city government to target residents who challenged her authority. The corruption investigation expanded beyond Karen herself, as federal agents traced the network of family connections that had allowed her to operate with impunity for years. City Council Chairman Davies resigned when investigators discovered he had approved budget increases for the sheriff's department in exchange for Karen's help pressuring political opponents. Planning Commissioner Mike Thompson, Karen's brother-in-law, was indicted for accepting bribes and falsifying permit applications. Karen's response to the mounting pressure was typical of her character. She doubled down and blamed everyone else. In a disastrous press conference, she claimed to be the victim of a witch hunt orchestrated by outside agitators and anti-police extremists. She insisted that her enforcement actions had always been by the book, and that any appearance of selective targeting was coincidental. The press conference only made things worse. Video clips of Karen refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing while surrounded by mountains of evidence went viral again, reinforcing the public perception that she was completely disconnected from reality. Community pressure reached a boiling point when the city council called an emergency session to address the growing scandal. The council chamber was packed with angry residents demanding Karen's resignation, many of them holding signs with quotes from her viral meltdown. One by one, Karen's former victims took the podium to tell their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez described years of harassment targeting her family. Mr. Washington detailed the systematic campaign of petty citations that followed their civil rights advocacy. Jennifer Martinez broke down in tears as she explained how Karen's lies had nearly destroyed her career and her children's sense of security. Through it all, Karen sat in the front row with her arms crossed and her face set in a permanent scowl, apparently believing that showing any remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing would be a sign of weakness. The council voted unanimously to request Karen's resignation and to begin the formal process of removal from office if she refused. The mayor, clearly trying to distance himself from the scandal, announced that the city would be hiring an independent firm to review all of the sheriff department's practices and procedures. Karen's defiant response was predictable. She refused to resign and announced her intention to fight all charges and investigations. In her statement, she claimed that stepping down would send the wrong message to criminals and troublemakers, and that she would continue to serve the law-abiding citizens who support strong law enforcement. But her support was evaporating rapidly. The police union distanced themselves from her actions. Fellow law enforcement officers privately expressed embarrassment about being associated with her behavior. Even her own deputies began requesting transfers to other departments. 6 months after my little free library was first targeted, I stood in my front yard watching Sheriff Karen being escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs. Her badge and gun surrendered forever to the federal marshals, who had arrested her on multiple charges of civil rights violations, conspiracy, and abuse of power under color of law. The federal investigation had been thorough and devastating. Karen was convicted on 17 counts, including deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and mail fraud related to falsified incident reports. The conspiracy charges were particularly damaging because they proved she had coordinated with family members in city government to systematically target residents who challenged her authority. Her trial had been a parade of victims testifying about years of harassment, intimidation, and selective enforcement. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge, clearly disgusted by the evidence, sentenced Karen to 8 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay restitution to the dozens of people she had targeted. The civil lawsuits that followed brought additional accountability. The city settled class action suits with Karen's victims for a total of $3.2 million, money that would help families like the Washingtons and Jennifer Martinez recover from years of harassment and financial burden. The settlement also required the city to implement new oversight procedures, bias training for all law enforcement personnel, and an independent citizen review board for police misconduct complaints. Perhaps most importantly, the scandal led to comprehensive reform of local government. The corrupt network of family connections that had protected Karen was dismantled as multiple officials resigned or were voted out of office. New ethics rules prohibited family members from serving in overlapping positions of authority, and transparency requirements made it much harder for future corruption to take root. My Maple Street Public Library branch had become more than just a neighborhood resource. It had evolved into a symbol of grassroots resistance and community empowerment. The beautiful pavilion hosted not just book exchanges, but also civic education workshops, voter registration drives, and community organizing meetings. Other neighborhoods across the country had reached out for advice on starting their own little free libraries, and several had named their projects after our successful fight against corruption. The most satisfying moment came when the state legislature passed the Community Library Protection Act, inspired directly by our case. The law enshrined strong protections for little free libraries and other forms of community information sharing, making it illegal for local authorities to target them without legitimate public safety concerns. Standing in my front yard that autumn evening, watching children play safely around the library pavilion that had caused so much trouble, I reflected on how dramatically our community had changed. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation that Karen had created was gone, replaced by a spirit of civic engagement and mutual support that I had never experienced before. Mrs. Rodriguez waved to me from across the street, where she was helping her grandchildren select books from the pavilion. The Washington couple stopped by daily to volunteer as librarians, sharing their love of reading with neighborhood children. Jennifer Martinez had been promoted at work and often brought her kids to do homework at the library's reading table. Most importantly, we had learned that ordinary citizens could challenge corruption and win, even when the system seemed stacked against them. It required courage, careful planning, and the willingness to document everything meticulously. But it was possible to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. As I locked up the library pavilion for the night and headed inside to my quiet house, I smiled at the irony of it all. Sheriff Karen had tried to silence me by targeting my little free library. Instead, she had created a platform that exposed her corruption to the entire country and brought justice not just for me, but for dozens of other people she had wronged. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be silenced.